nice to see some familiar faces and many new faces. I definitely cannot promise the best new work in philosophy. I can definitely promise some work of some kind. I'm really excited to get your feedback though. Okay, so my talk is called Mistreating Consent, and roughly speaking, I'm interested in cases of consent that are moot or modally irrelevant. So these are cases where someone consents to someone else performing some action, but if that person hadn't consented, the other person would have performed that action anyway. So just to give you a sense of some of the concrete cases I'm thinking about, I have on the handout car and sex, very, very cleverly titled cases. So first we have car. So Arvin consents to Blake borrowing his car. However, had Arvin not consented, Blake would have used the car anyway. The second case involves consent to sex, and I should give some content warning or trigger warning. I'll be talking about cases related to sexual assault, though not in any like graphic detail, but of course, please feel free to take any time you need. So the second case involves consent to sex. So Audrey consents to have sex with Brice. However, had Audrey not consented, Brice would have had sex with her anyway. So these cases illustrate what I'm going to call moot consent, which occurs sort of roughly, this is the sort of rough initial gloss. These cases occur when A consents to someone else B fying. However, had A not consented, B would have fied anyway. So I think these cases are really disturbing, but I found it difficult to isolate what's so disturbing about them. I hope you at least share that judgment, that there's something troubling about these cases. So the two questions I want to ask and attempt to answer today are first, what, if anything, is problematic about cases involving moot consent? And then second, what, if any, harms or wrongs do agents who give moot consent incur? So for those of you who like puzzles, the puzzle version of this question is, how can consent be moot while still being consent? And the thought is that as we try to capture what's wrong with it being moot, this seems to push against it being morally valid, sort of transformative consent. So basically, the first part of the talk, I'm just going to give you some cases in the vicinity that I want to be able to distinguish, because as we'll see, an adequate account to an answer to these questions will sort of be able to capture the normative differences between a wide variety of nearby cases. So first, I want to distinguish two ways in which consent might be modally irrelevant, and sort of you might think moot based off the initial definition. So the first case is what we might call unknowingly moot consent. I'll just call it moot consent for ease of reference. And these are cases where A consents to someone else B fying. However, unbeknownst to A, B would have fied anyway. So just fill in the car case, for instance, that I mentioned earlier, such that Arvin consents to Blake borrowing his car. However, unbeknownst to Arvin, Blake would have used the car even in the absence of consent. I want to distinguish this from cases of what I'll call preemptive consent, again, just for ease of reference. And these are cases where an agent A knows that B will fy, and therefore A consents to B fying precisely to avoid being a victim of a crime. So here's the type of case I have in mind. Imagine that Arvin sees that Blake is about to take his car, but he's really good friends with Blake and doesn't want to view Blake as a thief or himself as a victim of a crime. So he just sort of waves to Blake and says, oh, no worries, you can have it. Just take the car for the day, no problem. We can also, of course, imagine cases of moot and preemptive consent to sex. And I think that some feminist theorists have already sort of discussed or gestured at these. So first, in her groundbreaking book, Unjust Sex, The Cultural Scaffolding of Rape, Nicola Gavey details a wide variety of cases where women consent as a strategic way to avoid rape. So basically, the idea here is that women will recognize that the sex is going to sort of occur, whether or not they want it to, so then they consent because they don't want to view themselves as a victim of rape. There's obviously something especially traumatizing about that. So they sort of waive their right against this interaction not occurring. So these are cases of preemptive consent. I should flag Nicola Gavey is a psychologist, so these are sort of like very rich anecdotes, not just like philosophers' cases like that I've given you. So I also think there's some precedent for thinking about moot consent, and this comes from a popular article by Reina Gattuso, who writes, a lot of sex feels like this, sex where we don't matter, where we may as well not be there, sex where we don't say no because we don't want to say no, sex where we say yes even, where we're even into it, but where we fear that if we did say no, it wouldn't matter, it wouldn't count because we don't count. And of course, I think there are different ways to fill in the details of the case that you might have in mind here, but I think one way of filling them out involves the consent being moot. So here's how I'm thinking about this. You might imagine someone who's sort of just a woman who consents to sex because she just wants to have sex, and then later on starts to worry, like, was my consent actually efficacious? Would the sex have happened even if I had not wanted it and had not agreed to it? And again, I think these cases are really disturbing. It's very disturbing to realize in retrospect that your consent was not actually relevant to the person you're engaging with. Okay, so just to summarize some of the differences we've seen between these two types of cases, I think they differ along like 3 key dimensions. So one, in the case of preemptive consent, the agent knows that their consent to be is irrelevant or sort of believes that it is. They consent precisely because they recognize this and they want to avoid being a victim. And then finally, in these cases, consent seems to have almost like the wrong direction of fit. I was told by Acton there, I'm not allowed to use that term, but it kind of makes sense to me. But the idea is like consent is like an action, like it's sort of an afterthought, like it's post hoc. You see the action is going to occur, and because you see that it's going to occur anyway, you just like agree to it. By contrast, in cases of moot consent, the agent, the consent giver, doesn't realize their consent is irrelevant, at least at the time. They consent for the quote-unquote right first order reasons, like they want to help their friends or they want to have sex. And then in these cases, consent appears to have the right directionality or direction of fit. It seems to the agent like it precedes the act in question. Okay, so those are some of the differences between preemptive and moot consent. And like I said earlier, we want our account of what's wrong with moot consent to at least sort of get at the relevant differences between them. But I also think there's another case in the vicinity we want to be able to sort of put on the table and distinguish. And this comes up in the variety of luck section. So in some sense, agents who give moot consent get lucky in the sense that their will aligns with what's going to happen anyway. But it's also important to distinguish another type of luck, and these are what I'm going to call the thwarted cases. So here, B, the sort of perpetrator, the bad guy, intends to defy, but is thwarted by some external circumstances. So for example, you have thwarted theft. Theo intends to steal Amir's car, but he slips in a banana peel and has to be hospitalized. And obviously you can imagine versions of this regarding like thwarted rape. So one desideratum for an account of what's wrong with moot consent is going to be able to distinguish like what the normative differences are between at least 4 different types of cases. So we have the cases of moot consent or unknowingly moot consent, the cases of preemptive consent, the thwarted cases, and then finally instances of an actual crime such as rape or theft. So intuitively it seems, and some people might disagree with this, and we can talk about it in Q&A, that there's an important difference between giving moot consent and actually, say, being a victim of theft or rape or some other crime. So we want our account to be able to distinguish those. Okay, so those are all the cases on the table. I'm definitely curious what people think about how they differ like intuitively, because of course my account is designed to capture my intuitions about how they differ, but I'm happy for people to push back against that as well. Maybe I'm not sort of classifying them correctly. Okay, so the plan now is just to go through 2 accounts of what's wrong with moot consent that are basically just going to be on opposite ends of the spectrum, like 2 different extremes. One will be overly inflationary, the other will be too deflationary. This is a very standard philosophy talk where my account will be the sort of Goldilocks in the middle, and hopefully meet all of the desideratum. Okay, so the first account claims that moot consent is problematic because it's not actually valid consent. So of course, consent needs to be valid in order to be morally transformative. There are different conditions on this. So for example, it needs to be adequately informed, competently given, not coerced, and so on. And you might think, well, moot consent is not actually valid consent. And there's different ways of thinking about like valid consent. So you might think there's like valid consent and then there's invalid consent, and those are both sort of types of consent. Another perhaps more natural way of thinking about it is that invalid consent is just not even really consent. It's like what a fake diamond is to a diamond. It's not really a diamond. This is just a sort of conventional difference depending on what literatures you look at. So here's one way to motivate the thought that moot consent is not actually valid consent, perhaps in some sense no consent at all. So valid consent must be informed. So in other words, there are these informational requirements on validity. Different ways to flesh this out. On one, it requires knowing, quote, everything that would make a real difference to whether or not the agent wants to consent. One way to systematize this thought is in terms of a deal breaker style account inspired by Tom Doherty's important work, where a deal breaker is any feature of some act that makes a, quote, decisive difference to whether the agent's decision to buy. So there's sort of counterfactual tests for deal breakers. If the agent had known about the feature, he would not have agreed to it if this feature is a deal breaker for her. And then, of course, you can kind of fill in the details. You might think, well, plausibly, a deal breaker is that your consent is moot. If you were to learn that your consent was irrelevant to the person that you're consenting to, you probably wouldn't have given it in the first place. So in other words, the fact that your consent is moot seems to be like a deal breaker for you. I think this account has some clear virtues. So one obvious one is that it gives us really clear answers to our starting questions. So what's wrong with moot consent? Well, it's just invalid consent. What harms or wrongs are incurred by agents who give moot consent? Just whatever harms or wrongs are incurred in virtue of giving invalid consent. I think this view has other virtues as well, like it might capture differences both sort of among individuals and also across cases. So for in some cases, maybe like a low stakes case, like if, you know, my friend or colleague borrows my pen, if I hadn't consented, they would have taken the pen anyway, but you might think, well, I don't really think my consent is invalid in this case because it's not a deal breaker for me. So I think it can capture some differences across cases, and that seems like a virtue. But unfortunately, I think this account runs into several, I think, devastating problems. This is on the second page of the handout for anyone following along. So first, quite famously, this framework over-generates. There are lots of counterexamples to deal breaker style accounts in the literature. A lot of them involve like racist and transphobes. So I'm just going to focus on a more benign case of disappointing sex. So you might think if you knew in advance that sex would be disappointing, you wouldn't have consented to it. But intuitively, we can obviously consent to disappointing. So that's like a counterexample to this type of accounts. You need to sort of fine-grain it a bit more to rule out certain cases. So here's a more specific version of the overgeneration worry that's sort of central to my focus on moot consent. So we might distinguish between locally relevant and generally moot consent. Not the best terminology, but here's the type of case I have in mind. So imagine that Laura's consent to Brice is relevant. So Brice wouldn't have had sex with her if she didn't consent. But the fact that Audrey's consent is irrelevant to Brice is a deal breaker for Laura. And the intuitive thought here is that Laura doesn't want to have sex with someone who's disposed to sexually assault anyone, even if he's not disposed to assault her. But intuitively, at least to me, and I'm curious if people disagree with this judgment, it seems to me like Audrey's case is worse than Laura's, and I don't think the deal breaker account adequately captures the difference between them, right? Because both of them have a deal breaker that's rendered the consent in both cases invalid. But there's something like the intuitive thought here is there's something like more directed about the harm to Audrey that you don't see in Laura's case. So then finally, I think this account fails to capture cases of preemptive consent, right? Those were sort of set up such that the person consents despite the fact that they realize the act is going to happen anyway. So it might matter at what time we're applying the test, right? So you're not going to go on a date with someone who for whom your consent is irrelevant, but if you're at the point where you realize the sex is going to happen no matter what, you might want to consent for the reasons that Nicola Gaby highlights, right? To avoid being a victim of rape or having this like additional trauma imposed on you. So there's sort of some value the thought is in adjusting your view of the normative situation, even if you can't control what actually happened. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But there's one other concern that I'll just flag. I'm not very confident in it because I think there are ways that a proponent of the deal breaker account could respond. I just wanted the devastating objections on here. No, just kidding. So the last sort of worry is that it's going to have to do some additional work to be able to say what the difference is between cases of moot consent to sex or to lending versus like a crime like rape or theft. And the thought is that on this account, there's no morally valid consent in either. But again, it seems like there's, to me at least, an intuitive difference between these cases. So it needs to wield in like additional machinery to distinguish those types of cases. But again, there are things that people can say here and things that people do say here. So I'm less confident in that objection. Okay. So the upshot here is that one argument for moot consent being invalid failed. Of course, I've definitely not ruled out every account on which moot consent is invalid. There could be other ones, but later on I'm going to try to give you some like high altitude reasons for thinking it's really attractive to be able to say that consent in these cases is valid, even though there's also in some sense something wrong with it. So if I could of course try to consider additional accounts on which the consent is invalid that maybe avoid these problems. But one, that would be piecemeal, and two, I think there's just general reasons why that route of going is not very attractive. Okay, so the next account is more deflationary, so it's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. So on this view, the consent receiver is just a jerk. Like they just have bad dispositions, they're a bad person. We're really just focused here on agent evaluation, but there's nothing wrong with the consent itself. Obviously, this is like a very bare bones view. I'm curious if people have suggestions for how one might develop it and make it more plausible. But here are just a few initial worries about just focusing on the bad disposition of the consent receiver. So it just seems intuitively unsatisfying to me, in part because there's no unified mens rea across these cases. There could be various ways of filling in the mental states of the consent receiver in these cases. Some of them might be really bad people and really malicious, and they know their own, like they know that the consent of this other person is irrelevant, that they proceed anyway. But there might be other cases where someone doesn't even realize that the consent of this other person in front of them would be irrelevant because they just don't know what they don't realize like what they would do in the world where they get a no. Second, I don't think this account has the resources to adequately distinguish the normative profiles of the moot cases, the thwarted cases, and the locally relevant cases. The locally relevant case was the Laura case, because it will just have to say the consent receiver has bad dispositions in each, or the B person has bad dispositions in each. But intuitively, to me, there's something again more directed about the about what goes on in the moot cases, which generally speaking will render them, I think, intuitively worse to me. And then finally, and this will come up more at the end, I think this account sort of fails to recognize the destructive social role that consent can play in these cases. But that'll basically be the sort of wrap up, which I think will help further motivate the idea that there's something, we want to be able to say there's something wrong with the consent itself, even if it's not so wrong that it counts as being invalid. So those are the two extremes. Now we'll get to my proposal, which hopefully is sort of in the middle. Because basically I'm going to say that the consent is valid, but it's defective. So in my view, the consent receiver wrongs the consent giver, at least in part by mistreating the consent. They mistreat the consent because the consent fails to play a proper role in their practical deliberation and their reasons for action. Importantly, this is compatible with it playing some role. So they might prefer to act with consent than without consent, but doesn't play a proper role insofar as they were willing to proceed without it. It doesn't have enough weight, basically. One virtue of this account is it sort of explains what work the modal gloss is doing. I haven't given a new account of what moot consent consists in, but at least we can sort of get a better approximation with my account of mistreating consent. And the idea here is that modality is primarily a proxy for motivations, and I think this is an attractive result because counterfactuals can sort of famously hold for weird reasons. So it'd be very weird if our ultimate account of moot consent required it had some metaphysical status, right? So one way to illustrate why it seems like it's the initial gloss I gave you is not, it's really just an approximation. It's just used to help glom onto this notion of moot consent. Involves Frankfurt style cases. So here's one. This one comes from Victor Tadros. So Bill is strongly attracted to Lisa, who is in love with Bill, and Bill consents to sex with her only for these reasons. However, Lisa's violent brother wants Bill to have sex with Lisa and would have threatened Bill with death to get him to consent had he not already done so. So the idea here is that the consent in this case is modally irrelevant, that they would have had sex anyway. But there's nothing intuitively wrong with the consent itself, though obviously there's something wrong with Lisa's brother. You can also imagine a sort of reverse Frankfurt case where suppose like had Audrey not consented, Brice wouldn't have had sex with her, but only because she would have pulled out his mace. She would have pulled out her mace. And again, both of these sorts of Frankfurt style cases and reverse Frankfurt style cases illustrate that it's not really like the sort of modal status of the consent that's at issue here. Rather, modality is a sort of proxy for motivation. So if from the sort of initial gloss, you might wonder like, well, why should I care about modality? In other words, why should I care about what happens in worlds where I don't consent, especially if these worlds might be, for whatever reason, very far away? And I think the answer is that it shows us something important about the reasons that the consent receiver responded to when acting. And on this point, I'm borrowing a line from Alison Hills, who in her review of Pettit's robust demands of the good writes, if Gwendolyn would not tell Jack the truth, if his name were in earnest, then telling the truth is not her real reason for action. And similarly, I think by considering what the consent receiver would do in the absence of consent, we better understand their reasons for action, or at least the cases of technically moot consent are problematic in just those cases, when it reveals something problematic about the reasons for action. So I think there's also something additional going on in the cases of moot consent that I started with. And this is that the consent receiver doesn't know that their consent is being mistreated. They have a mistaken belief. This is a mistaken belief about the consent receiver's motivational profile. The consent receiver might even be actively deceiving them about their own motivational profile in some cases. And I think this is an important difference between the moot cases and the preemptive cases, because as I highlighted at the beginning, in the moot cases, in the preemptive cases, the person consents sort of with full knowledge and recognition of the fact that their consent is not actually efficacious. It's not relevant to whether the action occurs. At best, it's only relevant to the normative status of it. So I think one virtue of my account then is it explains, unfortunately it's disjunctive, but hopefully there's a payoff to that. So it explains what the cases of moot consent and preemptive consent have in common, right? They both involve mistreated consent, but only in the moot cases you also have this additional problem, which is the mistaken belief. This mistaken belief might undermine the voluntariness of the action, though I don't think it undermines the validity, but I'm happy to talk about that. Okay, so finally, I promised you some general reasons for thinking that the consent in these cases was valid. So I'll give you those now and then try to motivate the thought that there's still something wrong with the consent itself. So 3 reasons why we should treat the consent as valid in these cases. One, it seems like whether an agent's consent is valid should not depend on B's reasons for action. And this is especially the case given that B's reasons for action might be opaque to B themselves. And I'm not sure there's any obligation for people to have full self-knowledge. I'm not even sure if we always can have full self-knowledge about our own motivational profiles. So the idea is that this would just raise too high of a bar, an epistemic bar for morally valid consent. If in order to know whether consent was valid, we also needed to know facts about what was motivating the consent receiver. Second, and this is a point of disagreement in the literature, I think some of our interests are protected by being able to consent even in non-ideal circumstances. And I think the cases of preemptive consent sort of nicely illustrate this. So like I said earlier, Gaby is not a philosopher, she's a psychologist, but women are very resistant to describing these cases of involving preemptive consent as rape. They think they sort of strategically avoided rape. And the idea is that, again, that there's some value to maintaining normative control over the situation, even when you had to give up descriptive control. Then finally, I think that this, by saying that it's valid, we can easily distinguish between cases of moot consent and actual crime, right? It's just the difference between valid versus invalid consent or no consent at all. So we don't have to do any sort of additional fancy footwork or in order to distinguish them, unlike the deal breaker style account. Still, I do think there's something wrong with the consent itself. In these cases, it's not that it's invalid, but there is something defective about it. So the idea is that in the ideal case, we want consent to not only be present, but also play a central role in the consent receiver's reasons for action. So here I'm borrowing a distinction from Massimo Renzo, my colleague at King's, and he distinguishes between ideal versus defective consent. I'm going to gloss the distinction a little bit differently, but it's the same spirit. So in cases of ideal consent, we have in agent A consenting to be spying, but in addition, the fact that A consents plays a proper role in B's practical deliberation or reasons for action. And in cases of defective consent, you just have the first condition, but not the second condition present. So there's still consent, but the consent is not playing its sort of proper role. I think there's some further payoffs of this distinction just outside of this debate. One I'll just flag briefly is that I think this helps us diagnose some disagreements in the literature about the nature of consent, and the idea is that some people are focused on consent as a sort of as ideal consent, basically. Other people are thinking about consent more as a minimal standard. So finally, I'll just highlight how my view answers the initial questions we started with and satisfies the desideratum for extensional adequacy. So this is just the final page of the handout. So what's wrong with moot consent? Well, it's mistreated consent and it's defective. And in addition, there's a mistaken belief in these cases that you don't see in instances of preemptive consent. What wrongs are incurred? Well, I think there could be lots of wrongs or harms that are incurred. Some of them will be those that result from these flaws they just highlighted. So for example, it might be insensitive, disrespectful, involve a lack of care or regard. It can involve a failure to treat someone as if they have sort of proper control over what happens to them. And in some cases, it might involve active deception about, your own motivational profiles. Okay, it also, I think, adequately distinguishes between the four cases we started with. So what's the difference between moot consent and a crime? I've already highlighted it. It's just the traditional distinction between there being valid consent versus invalid or no consent. The difference between moot versus preemptive consent. Both are defective, and like I said, my view allows us to highlight what they have in common, but there's only a mistaken belief in the former. In the latter cases of preemptive consent, you consent with sort of full knowledge that your consent is not efficacious. Third, moot consent versus locally relevant consent. So this is like the Laura versus Audrey contrast. So the thought here is that only Audrey's consent is mistreated, Laura's consent is not, because Brice wasn't willing to act without it. And then finally, the moot versus thwarted cases. I think there's nothing mistreated in the thwarted cases because there's no action to explain. It's because the question, why did someone spy, only makes sense if they did, in fact, spy. I should flag, I'm least certain about how to think about the thwarted cases, so I welcome conflicting intuitions about any of these cases, but I've gotten some pushback on those especially, so I'm especially curious to hear thoughts. Okay, so as you can see from the scorecard, my view has all the checks and none of the X's, so it ultimately wins. Checkmate. So I'll just now end with just some further thoughts about the epistemology of moot consent and sort of bring it back again to the real world context of women navigating specifically moot and preemptive consent to sex. So unfortunately, I think that moot and preemptive consent to sex are pervasive, though I think very under-theorized in the literature. So we might ask, well, how do we identify or navigate it? Unfortunately, one of the many things women have to navigate during sex is determining whether their consent was relevant or irrelevant. After all, most of us don't want to sleep with or continue sleeping with people for whom our consent is of little practical importance. So how can we try to avoid getting into this situation? And I think Gattuso, who I mentioned earlier, perceptively highlights two answers to these questions. So when she discusses testing, so women might sort of test someone's ability to take a no. So they indicate signs of disinterest at different stages of the interaction just to see how someone responds, see if they sort of pressure them or just like pull back. There's also a skit by, or a comedy special by Taylor Tomlinson, where he basically talks about sort of testing someone's ability to take a no at an earlier sign at an earlier point in the interaction, like on a date. So for example, she says, I pretend I'm not ready to have sex with someone new yet, just to make sure they're a good person first. Another type of strategy involves corroborating, and this is more like retrospective. So Gattuso described getting this feeling that her consent was irrelevant with someone that she later heard was a rumored rapist. And the idea here is that if you suspect your consent was moot, and then later learn that your sexual partner had sexually assaulted someone else, then this might corroborate your suspicions. Most people are not like Laura, especially in that their consent is relevant to someone, but others' consent is not. So if you learn that your sexual partner was disposed to have non-consensual sex with others, you might justifiably wonder what would have happened if you hadn't consented. And again, I don't think that these are sort of like, you might think I started out with sort of like fictional cases, like, oh, I found this new like puzzle or something, but I think these are real world things that women talk about navigating, both like sort of casually and also in some feminist writing. So I started this talk out by contrasting cases of moot and preemptive consent, but I think in reality, many cases lie in between them. So for example, someone might wonder whether their consent was irrelevant or suspect that it is, as opposed to sort of fully recognize that it is. Someone might consent partly as a strategic way to avoid being a victim of a crime and partly because they want to have sex. Someone might also only come to believe that her consent was moot in retrospect. However, recognizing this might prompt her to preemptively consent in the future in order to avoid the risk of rape. And this generates, I think, a problematic feedback loop. Someone comes to believe that her consent was moot, and that's sort of like retrospectively, and hence later consent preemptively to avoid taking the gamble of finding out what happens if she doesn't consent. Finally, this contributes to a culture of fear, which I think can be precisely the point. Women comply and consent to sex, sometimes sex that is wanted, sometimes sex that is unwanted, to avoid finding out what happens if they don't. So just to wrap up, I think these cases of moot consent are disturbing. At least I found them really disturbing, but it's difficult to articulate why they are, at least while preserving morally relevant distinctions. On my account, moot consent is mistreated consent. And it's mistreated because, again, the consent fails to play a proper role in the consent receiver's reasons for action and motivational profile. And unfortunately, far from being a philosophical fiction, I think moot consent, especially to sex, is something that many women must and already do navigate. This exposes a further side of social injustice that I think has been underexplored and under-recognized. If society is structured such that women cannot be confident that acts of consent actually make a difference to whether they suffer sexual assault or rape, then consent cannot do all of the normative work we want it to do. That's it.